I'm David Westin, and we're delighted to have with us now Senator Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina. So, Senator Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. We're talking about historically black colleges and universities across the country, something you've taken a particular interest in. Tell us why. Why are they important to this country?
Well, David, if you think about the professional class of African Americans who are college educated, you would realize that half of all the professionals in this country doing excellent work in many different fields comes from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. So when you support HBCUs, you support the engine that creates professionals from lawyers, doctors, and military generals. Our general officers, nearly half of all general officers in the military have come from or come through an HBCU. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers all find their start in a historically black college or university. And in South Carolina, we are home to a number, 8 HBCUs. And the truth is that our state is better because we have options for kids to be highly educated, incredibly competent, and then very productive in the workforce. So I'm a supporter of common sense, and this, in my opinion, is one of the ways that I see common sense coming to fruition in education.
So, Senator, as you understand it, why is that the case? Why is it the case that historically black college and universities so over-index, so overperform in turning out particularly professionals, for example, for our society? In this day and age, why do they do that?
Well, I think it's the history of education that's just as important as the present day in education. Historically, for many African Americans in the 60s and before, access to college education was very limited. And so HBCUs, though they were founded 100 years ago plus, for many of the institutions, they provided a springboard of opportunity for many African Americans in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. That excellence continues through the 21st century. Access to quality education has been a struggle that we have been making great advancements on in the last several years. The good news is today's HBCUs are very diverse. You think about Kentucky State University, which is an HBCU, it has about 45% of its student population non-African American. And so what we're seeing in today's HBCUs is that we have the type of diversity we see across the country now populating the chairs and the desks of HBCUs throughout the country.
So how are they doing from your point of view? I think there's something like 101, I read, HBCUs across the country. How are they doing? Because I've heard some reports that perhaps some attendance is down, some enrollment is down over the last several years.
Yeah, there's no doubt that if you think about HBCUs from a monolithic perspective, it's hard to get a gauge on how well they're doing. If you think about the type of diversity that we see in this country, you have diversity within the HBCU footprint. So some are doing very well. We have flagships across the country. At Tuskegee, you have Morehouse, you have South Carolina State, Claflin, Voorhees, of course, all South Carolina schools. At North Carolina A&T, one of the largest HBCUs, if not the largest HBCU in the country, doing very well. Kentucky State has a new president, so to speak, last couple of years from Charleston, South Carolina. They're doing extremely well. You also have flagship of Howard here in the D.C. area that's doing well. The question really is, how do we make sure that the firepower that's coming out of HBCUs and the institutions themselves that were for too long without adequate funding, making sure that the playing field is level for those HBCUs going forward. I am thankful that during the previous administration, we saw HBCU funding hit its highest level in the history of the country. And for the first time ever, we made it permanent funding. That will change the game going forward for the rest of our history as a nation. And frankly, even during the pandemic, we provided more than $1 billion of emergency funding for HBCUs. We did infinitely more for colleges and universities throughout the country. So what we've understood here in our nation is what we are focusing on all across the spectrum in education, and resourcing it effectively means that we're going to have better, brighter youngsters leading our country in the right direction for generations to come.
You mentioned the Trump administration, and I know that President Trump was quite proud, I believe, of what they did for HBCUs in the
Yes.
administration at that point. At the same time, you also point out some of the financial considerations, because there are indications a lot of the students of color who go to HBCUs have a tougher time financially, and the schools themselves don't have the endowments we typically have in some of the other universities across the country. What do they need most right now, HBCUs across the country?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. That I always look for the secret sauce, and there's never one simple ingredient to the secret sauce of success or significance. And in HBCUs, that's the same as well. One of the things I would suggest is that the alumni associations have a greater opportunity to play a significant role in funding or resourcing the HBCUs and playing a vital role in advocating on behalf of the HBCUs. They do a pretty good job now. We could always do a better job, and I think that's something that I'm starting to see across the country as I get phone calls from alumni associations looking to become more engaged in the process. I started a HBCU fly-in where I brought the presidents and chancellors together about 6 years ago for the first time so that they could advocate on behalf of themselves before Congress and the White House. And because of those efforts, we've seen Pell Grants go up, year-round Pell Grants become available, and more resources. And another part of that secret sauce is the private sector. Ultimately, education is about getting a job. And one of the things that the chancellors and presidents requested from me was more interfacing with the private sector. And so one of the fourth or the fifth fly-in, we focused on getting the private sector more engaged, more involved with HBCUs, especially using virtual opportunities to invite the student to an interview to make sure that they have the same access and opportunity, even if they're not in the same region of the jobs. And that has proven to be a powerful part of that secret sauce as well. And then what we're working on today and in the next few years, I believe, is making sure that the maintenance issues on campuses, we have historically they have a large footprint of historically significant buildings on these campuses that have been at times in disrepair. Others needed maintenance and others are doing well. But we are trying to focus our attention on making sure that the infrastructure is as well funded as is any other college or university in the country.
Senator Scott, tell us about that. I think it's called the Ignite. That's the acronym for the bill that you're working on. It's a bipartisan bill, as I understand it, to really invest in the infrastructure in a broad sense in HBCUs. Tell us about that bill.
Yeah, everything needs an ignition. And one of the things that we do with the Ignite Act is we literally provide HBCUs with the resources necessary to take care of the maintenance. When I was a younger fella working for the first time on a performance audit committee for the state of South Carolina, the one thing that it came true and clear to me in the late 90s was that too many of our educational institutions, even on the K through 12 side, didn't have a maintenance budget, as if we didn't know we were going to have to maintain buildings. There was so much money invested in the structure itself, but too little resources set aside for the maintenance. That seems to be the case with roads, with bridges, with ports, with airports, and unfortunately with schools as well. And so what we try to do is find a way to strike an appropriate balance in the legislation. The House and the Senate versions are slightly different. We anticipate that our appropriators will be able to determine what the need really is. And so as opposed to being overly prescriptive as it relates to a number, I expect our committee structures to allow for us to evaluate and then to identify the appropriate resourcing on an annual basis to be appropriated to those universities and colleges, specifically HBCUs, as it relates to the maintenance obligation and responsibility that they have.
So I find that particularly interesting because I didn't see a number, an overall number, X amount of money to go for it. Well, I think what you're saying is you're not putting a number in, you're trying to put together a process where each year you'll determine how much. Is that the proposal? Because I'm not familiar with that way of approaching it.
Yeah, it's a different approach. The House put in, I think, $5 billion in their bill. They had flirted with numbers that were even higher. My thought was this: let's take a step back from being overly prescriptive on the amount of dollars that we need. Let's evaluate the need, and then let's fund that need over a meaningful amount of time so that we do the right thing, and that what we're not asking for is special treatment of our HBCUs. What we are asking for is a level playing field within the structure of a higher education that did not exist previously. Now we have a chance to do it right, not make up for the past, but to invest in the future. And that's a very big difference as I look at what we're trying to accomplish. And so with that as a goal and the objective, I want there to be a process that we identify and evaluate the needs being submitted. And that process will help us to determine the amount of resources that are necessary. And then we fund the portions of it that we can, and we come back to fight and live to fight another day next year. That process to me is an important engagement, and it's the way that we maintain a responsible level of funding, but we also maintain a responsible level of oversight to make sure that we are doing the best we can with tax dollars, which of course is really your dollars and the dollars of your friends and your neighbors and loved ones. So we want to make sure that we use those dollars as wisely as possible.
And as worthwhile as this cause is, there are a lot of people clamoring for a lot of dollars right now on Capitol Hill.
Yes.
There's a big process going through, whether it's the reconciliation or the infrastructure. I can go on and on. Are you having difficulty making progress given the fact that there are so many people asking for things right now?
Well, certainly we found a pretty good, I found a good appetite on the Hill for talking about higher education and specifically HBCUs. Where the problem is, of course, is the level of spending that we are talking about on Capitol Hill, in my opinion, is way too high. But it also lacks the type of process that I've just described for HBCUs and the infrastructure and the maintenance needs within those institutions. I'm willing to take a look at what we need, not just what we want. And when you look at the spending here on Capitol Hill, you think about the $1.9 trillion COVID package, followed by a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, followed by up to a $3.5 trillion new definition of infrastructure, family infrastructure plan, and then you tack on top of all of that a $4 trillion annual spending plan. That's about $10.5, $10.6 trillion in one fiscal year, which in my opinion is actually irresponsible, and that I'll be voting against much of that. But the truth is that if we were to take a step back and evaluate the needs, that number would come down significantly, and our ability to make progress on our priorities that actually fall in the laps of your federal government, we would make more progress if we had more focus and used a harness as opposed to just using the shotgun approach, trying to send money everywhere, especially when you evaluate the fact that in the 5 packages that we passed in 2020, we have hundreds of billions of dollars that have not yet been spent. So the question isn't how much. The answer is too much. The question is, are we actually hitting the target? I think what we're going to find out as a nation is that we missed a target because we had no target. That will not be the way that we act through the legislation that I'm looking at and working on.
Senator, you mentioned a level playing field. You've been active in really supporting HBCUs for some time. As I understand, we already have a statute in place, in part because of you, dealing with federal agencies to basically say there's a level playing field in dealing with HBCUs. Tell us what progress you've made already.
Well, we've made a lot of progress, and you can see the definition of progress are the resources being deployed to HBCUs from different parts of the federal government. One specific part that has been increasing over the last few years is military engagement with our HBCUs. As we think about the STEM future of this nation and the world, we must make sure that we have diverse candidates as a part of that process. I think we get there by investing in our HBCUs from our military so that we have more candidates understanding and appreciating the necessity of a strong military apparatus to keep us safe and secure as a nation. And the more investment you have in these HBCUs from our military, the more investment you'll get from the students as it relates to our national security apparatus. I think it's a win-win scenario. It's one of the opportunities that we have to see more innovation and creativity that benefits every single American coming through and from our HBCUs. So it's good news for our country. I'm a kid that grew up in the Deep South that appreciates the fact that we're all better together. And frankly, one of the ways that we get there is to make sure that every single American feels like this is our country and we are one American family. When we point the resources all across this nation in a responsible way, I think we have that sense of belonging and a sense of responsibility that grows out of the sense of belonging. So this is a good thing, and we can measure the success, and if we can't measure it, we probably shouldn't do it.
Finally, Senator, put the HBCU role in our society in a larger context. We have been through more than one tragedy, I would say, in this country over the last couple of years. One of them certainly is the pandemic and what it's done to all of us. Killed so many people, really hurt our economy. But beyond that, we had real racial tensions brought to the fore again with George Floyd and so many other incidents. A lot of concern about it. Is that affecting the attitude toward HBCUs? And particularly, go back to what you said earlier about the private sector. Is the private sector more likely to step up and help now? Because one of the problems I think many people think is a real inequality historically, including in educational opportunity.
Well, you know, one of the things I love about America, and one of the reasons I'm so proud to be an American, is that when all the chips are down and there's a challenge, we all seem to come together. We saw that through the pandemic. One of the things that we see with our HBCUs in the midst of the pandemic is that too many kids, when we're talking about virtual education, they didn't have broadband connections at their homes. HBCUs served as hotspots for so many kids, millions of kids. In rural America, frankly, as much as the inner cities of America, because once again, the diversity of the HBCU student population has never been more diverse. When we think about responding to some of the social tragedies that we see, unfortunately, too often on TV stations, what we know is that our HBCUs are providing excellence in education, which leads to excellence in economic mobility and opportunity. I'll make it more personal than even all of that. In Charleston, South Carolina, we had the Mother Emanuel church shooting, and 9 amazing people lost their lives, were murdered in that church shooting. The vast majority of those folks who lost their lives attended an HBCU somewhere in South Carolina. And very quickly, 36 hours after the shooting, those loved ones of those family members came before a camera, just like we were talking today, and they forgave the killer of their family members. A part of that is a foundation that was laid through faith-based organizations like HBCUs in South Carolina. The role of understanding how you respond to tragedy. So not just the educational component, not just the financial component, but what it means to be at the top of the understanding of what it means to be an American. A part of that ethos comes through institutions like historically black colleges and universities. And without that type of leadership, I'm not sure where my state would be today. And so, as I said during some of the funeral services, as I said during some of the challenges, sitting there through funeral after funeral after funeral, I was incredibly thankful for an anchor in our state, which was, in fact, our historically black colleges and universities, that was like a rudder to a ship.
It's so terribly powerful. I must say, I don't think any of us will forget those relatives of those lost ones down in South Carolina coming to camera, as you say, and forgiving the perpetrator. Thank you so very much, Senator Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina.
Have a good day, sir. Thank you, David.